Lecture 11. Adding complexity to plots.
In my first lecture on plot, I talked about the difference between story and plot. In the second lecture, I explained that many narratives have the same basic Aristotelian structure of situation, conflict, and resolution. This structure is also known as Freytag's pyramid, with its separate stages of exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, and denouement. I also said that you can play interesting variations on this basic plot structure that makes plotting both interesting and challenging. The underlying story in Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim fits Freytag's pyramid fairly well if you lay it out chronologically. But the way Conrad rearranges that chronology helps make Lord Jim one of the greatest novels ever written. And even if a narrative moves forward more or less chronologically, the way Middlemarch and A Song of Ice and Fire do, you can still complicate and enrich the plot by braiding together several stories or plot lines, or by leapfrogging separate narratives so that they come together in the end. So far, I've been talking about the structure of a narrative as a whole, but in this lecture, I want to talk about techniques that you can use on a smaller scale to make a plot more subtle and satisfying. These include suspense, flash forwards, flashbacks, and foreshadowing. But before I get started, I want to introduce a sweeping generalization that may make plotting seem less daunting to you. As I've said earlier, John Gardner wrote that plotting is one of the hardest things a writer does. I know from my own experience that many talented writers are more often intimidated by the idea of constructing a plot than they are by any other facet of fiction writing. And what often intimidates them is not that they don't know how to get started or what they want to say, but that they have so much they want to get across that they're worried about bogging the narrative down. So, here's my sweeping pronouncement. One of the fundamental principles of plotting is the withholding of information. At the beginning of a plot, you want the reader to know very little, but at the end, you want the reader to know everything. You might even say this is the essence of every plot that ever existed. A plot is the mechanism by which the writer decides what information to withhold, what information to reveal, and in what order. In many instances, the writer himself doesn't know as he starts how a story is going to turn out, but he certainly knows by the time he's finished writing it. A couple of lectures ago, I said that my high school English teacher, Mrs. Giltner, defined literature as the creation of order out of chaos. And way back in my lecture about evocation, I said that fiction suggests reality by choosing the most evocative details rather than trying to include every single detail about a character, a setting, or a situation. If writing fiction was just a matter of recording all the facts as they happen, then trial transcripts and surveillance videos would be the greatest works of art ever made. But in fiction, we're trying to create meaning out of this relentless stream of events, so you have to choose what to keep, what to leave out, and what order you put them in. Since all books and stories are read over time and can't be imbibed all at once, the most fundamental thing a writer withholds from the reader is how the story ends. In the simplest kind of stories, the ones that E.M. Forster said only answer the question, "and then?" this is the main reason to keep reading, to find out how it all turns out. But there are other kinds of withholding that result in more subtle plots. Take, for example, Shirley Jackson's famous story, The Lottery. Most American high school students have read this story at least once. It's about a small New England village which, once a year, for reasons that are never explained in the story, holds a lottery for all the adults in the village. The person who wins the lottery, so to speak, is stoned to death by all the others. Assuming you've read it before and I haven't just ruined the ending for you, you will remember what a shock it is to read this story for the first time. I was introduced to it in a high school English class, where the teacher had us all read it silently to ourselves, and you could tell when each reader got what was happening in the story by the separate little gasps all around the room. It's a beautifully crafted story on a lot of levels, but the main reason it works is that the author introduces the concept of the lottery in the very first paragraph, but she withholds from the reader what the lottery is actually for. What makes reading The Lottery especially gut-wrenching on a first reading is that the reader is the only person who doesn't know what's going on. The author certainly does, as do all the characters in the story. The story lulls you with its measured, uninflected evocation of the life of a seemingly normal country town, and then it springs the horror on you at the end. This kind of withholding puts the reader in a very lonely place. It's as if you're standing in a group of people you've known all your life, and you suddenly wake up to the fact that they're capable of killing you in cold blood. There's one other thing I want to point out about Jackson's withholding of information in The Lottery. This technique is not the same thing as an unreliable narrator, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. The narration of The Lottery is reliable. Everything the story tells us is true. It never misrepresents anything. It's just that the story withholds the single most important fact. That's a pretty simple kind of withholding, the surprise ending. And yet another kind of withholding is the creation of suspense. In a story that involves a surprise, the writer withholds information from the reader and sometimes from the characters. In a story that creates suspense, the writer withholds information from the characters but lets the reader in on the secret. Perhaps the most famous explanation of the difference between surprise and suspense comes from the great English film director Alfred Hitchcock. In the mid-1960s, he gave a famous series of interviews to the French director François Truffaut. Hitchcock used the example of placing a ticking bomb under a table while two characters are talking. If you don't show the audience the bomb, then they will be as surprised as the characters are when it goes off. This, Hitchcock said, can be a very satisfying effect. In fact, one of Hitchcock's most famous sequences, the shower scene in Psycho, is exactly that sort of surprise. But Hitchcock also says in the interview that he prefers suspense to surprise. In order to make the same situation suspenseful, two people talking while a bomb ticks down under the table, all you have to do is show the audience the bomb at the start of the scene without showing it to the characters. The result is that the audience feels anxious on behalf of the characters, who continue their conversation with no inkling of the danger they're in. As Hitchcock himself put it, in the first case, we have given the public 15 seconds of surprise at the moment of the explosion. In the second case, we have provided them with 15 minutes of suspense. There are other kinds of withholding that have to do with the rearranging of the elements of the traditional plot. These techniques are perhaps not so much about withholding information as they are simply about presenting it to the reader in an unusual order. Let's take exposition as an example. As John Gardner points out in The Art of Fiction, exposition can take place at any point in the narrative. In fact, in most cases, you want to save a good deal of your exposition for later. At the beginning of a narrative, you want to explain enough to intrigue the reader and keep her reading, but you don't want to explain too much. There are some exceptions to this practice. Writers of science fiction or historical fiction sometimes include a passage or a chapter at the beginning of a narrative in which they tell the reader everything she needs to know about the world of the story. This sort of exposition has an unlovely name, the info dump. These chapters can occasionally be tedious to read, even if they are the most efficient way of explaining a complicated world so that the writer can get the story going. On the other hand, most mainstream writers, and a lot of science fiction authors and historical novelists, prefer to provide exposition as needed and only then. If you manage to sneak the exposition in without the reader noticing that it's exposition, it can feel more natural than dropping it all on the reader's doorstep at once. In many cases, you can introduce exposition seamlessly by providing the information to the reader at the same time as the characters are learning it. Much of the traditional mystery novel, for example, consists of backstory and exposition, which gets parceled out in small doses. It would spoil the mystery to provide all the exposition at the start, because that would require saying who the murderer is. Instead, the reader helps to solve the mystery alongside the detective. Indeed, it's the withholding of backstory and exposition that makes a mystery novel a mystery novel. Or consider the inciting action, which you may recall is the moment that conflict is introduced into a story and gets the plot going. In popular fiction, the inciting action often comes at the very beginning, even before the exposition. A good example is the opening of the movie Jaws. The very first thing that happens in the movie is that a young woman at a party goes for a midnight swim on the beach and gets eaten by a shark. Only then are we introduced to Chief Brody, the first of three main characters, and only after we meet Chief Brody are we introduced to the island community of Amity. And later on, when the rising action of the story is well underway, we are introduced to the other two main characters, Hooper, the young marine biologist, and Quint, the grizzled old fisherman. In other words, we get the inciting incident in the first 5 minutes, then we get the exposition, and we don't even meet the third major character until halfway through the film. All the traditional elements of Freytag's pyramid are there, but in a different order. In fact, you can even structure a story so that you give away the climax in the first few moments. In other words, you put the climax ahead of everything else. The novel Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin is structured this way. Giovanni's Room is the story of a young American named David who was living in Paris in the early 1950s and wrestling with his own sexuality. As a teenager, he had a sexual relationship with another boy, but he resists thinking of himself as gay. In fact, in the years since, he has gotten involved with a young woman. Meanwhile, living in Paris, he falls in love with another man, an Italian named Giovanni, who works as a bartender in a place owned by a Frenchman named Guillaume. Without going into all the details, suffice it to say that Giovanni ends up murdering Guillaume, that he is sentenced to death by guillotine, and that David feels responsible for Giovanni's fate. The novel is told in the first person by David. Recalling Forster's distinction between story and plot, please note that the story of Giovanni's Room starts chronologically years before, with David recalling his childhood and teenage years in flashback. The plot, however, starts on the evening before Giovanni's execution, which is nearly the end of the story. By page 2, we know that David and Giovanni had been lovers, and by page 3, we know that Giovanni is going to be executed the following morning. So after only 3 pages, we know that David and Giovanni had an affair, that it led to disaster, and that David is racked with guilt over it. If you lay out the events of this story in chronological order, as opposed to its structure as a plot, it looks like a Freytag pyramid. But instead of following that structure, Baldwin very shrewdly gives us the most dramatic element right from the start, namely the upcoming execution. This has the effect of intriguing the reader, making him want to know exactly how things turned out so badly. In fact, Baldwin does an even more interesting thing later on. Even though he opens the novel by telling us that Giovanni is going to be executed, he never actually shows us the climax. The night before the execution, David is miles away from the prison in a house in the French countryside. Having promised that he would be present for the execution, David loses his nerve and refuses to go to the prison. In the last few pages of the book, he imagines what Giovanni's execution is like, but he doesn't actually witness it. The resolution of the plot on the very last page is David's descent into guilt, self-doubt, and self-recrimination. It might seem that Baldwin isn't actually withholding anything in Giovanni's Room. After all, he's giving away the ending in the first 3 pages. But I think he's actually engaging in a more subtle kind of withholding. That is, he's withholding the full effect and meaning of Giovanni's impending death on David, which we don't really understand until the book's final pages. If you look at it as a conventional binary plot, will David and Giovanni find happiness together, the book blows it in the first chapter. But if you look at it as a more subtle kind of binary narrative, will David accept his share of responsibility for Giovanni's predicament, the novel works wonderfully well. As much as I love The Lottery and the films of Alfred Hitchcock, their kind of withholding is more mechanical than what Baldwin is doing in Giovanni's Room. In The Lottery, Shirley Jackson withholds what happens at the climax, while in Giovanni's Room, Baldwin withholds why the climax happens. In each case, the reader is compelled by the writer to read the whole narrative to get to the truth. In fact, what Baldwin is doing in the opening of Giovanni's Room is an especially extreme example of a flash forward. As the name implies, a flash forward is the opposite of a flashback. Both flash forwards and flashbacks are scenes that take place out of the main chronological order of the story. A flash forward is a glimpse of something that will happen to the characters in the future, at the end of, and perhaps even after, the main narrative, while a flashback is a scene that usually takes place before the main plot line started. Flash forwards are often used in first-person narratives. The narrator gives the reader a glimpse of an intriguing or dire outcome, as in Giovanni's room, and then returns to the beginning and shows how the story worked its way up to that point. Another famous first-person flash forward is the beginning of Billy Wilder's great film about Hollywood, Sunset Boulevard. This film opens with the narrator, a screenwriter named Joe Gillis, starting to tell his story from beyond the grave as we see his dead body floating in a swimming pool. The rest of the film then backs up and shows us how he ended up in the drink. But flash forwards don't necessarily have to appear only at the beginning of a plot. In fact, using a flash forward as a kind of teaser to hook the reader can occasionally come across as a rather mechanical effect. Remember that you can use a flash forward anywhere in a narrative. You can even do it at the end, when it's rather like fast forwarding a video, skipping the intervening time to show how the characters turn out years after the main chronology of the story. A very effective example is Alice Munro's long short story, The Beggar Maid. This story is about Rose, a young working-class woman from a small Ontario town, who goes away to college, where she is courted by Patrick, an awkward young man from Vancouver who happens to be the heir to a fortune. It's a 33-page story, and the first 30 pages take place more or less chronologically, showing the awkward courtship of Rose and Patrick over the course of a year or two. The last 4 pages of the story fast forward through their disastrous marriage and acrimonious divorce. The story ends in a final scene years later when they simply glance at each other in passing in the Toronto airport, and Rose realizes for the first time just how much Patrick despises her. Power of that devastating final scene comes, in part, from everything we know of their cumulative history. But the scene's power is also partly a product of that giant leap in chronology, showing us how two characters who have not met in years can still feel instantaneous rage at the sight of the other. Flashbacks, of course, are much more common. As I said a few minutes ago, detective stories tend to be made up mostly of flashbacks, as the detective or investigator hears from witnesses about the situation that led up to the murder. But flashbacks can also be used to great effect in other genres or in mainstream fiction. For one thing, flashbacks can be used as replacements for, or in combination with, exposition. They are especially useful when you're trying to present the reader with necessary information about the previous history of a character. Flashbacks are often used in preference to a simple piece of exposition if the information about the character is particularly important or dramatic. For example, early in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, a young girl named Denver recalls what her mother told her about the circumstances of Denver's birth. To put it simply, Denver's mother, Setha, was an escaped slave on the run when she gave birth to Denver in a patch of wild onions on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, just across the river from freedom. It's an important piece of information about Denver's past and about Setha's struggle to be free. Morrison could easily have taken care of it in a brief expository summary, but instead, she has Denver remember her mother telling her the story of her own birth. This then segues effortlessly into a third-person account of the birth itself, showing it in graphic and powerful detail. By using a dramatic flashback instead of a simple expository description, Morrison is emphasizing how important this episode is in the lives of Setha and her daughter, and how important it is to the rest of the plot. The main narrative of Beloved takes place in the years after the Civil War, but many of the scenes are flashbacks to the lives of its main characters before the war, when they were still slaves. Much of the power of the book comes from showing us how the past haunts the present, and that effect comes in large part from Morrison's frequent and skillful use of flashbacks. This brings me now to foreshadowing, which is not the same thing as a flash forward. A flash forward is a fully evoked and dramatized scene set in the future, but foreshadowing is a hint or a series of hints that a writer plants early in the narrative in order to prepare the way for what comes later. In many instances, the success of a narrative's resolution depends on how carefully the writer has prepared the way. Simply put, you want the resolution to be unpredictable but satisfying, and pulling that off requires a balance between withholding information so that the reader can't predict what's going to happen, and revealing just enough information so that the reader doesn't feel cheated when the ending is revealed. In other words, you want the end of the story to feel both surprising but inevitable. The response you want from the reader is, at the same moment, "Oh my God," and "Of course." You want the reader to think, "I should have seen that coming," but without actually allowing her to see it coming. This is where foreshadowing comes in. Some of it is fairly mechanical. You want to make sure that you introduce all the characters, the context, and even the props that you need for a story to pay off. We've all felt cheated by stories or movies where the writer or filmmaker pulls something out of his hat at the last moment to make the ending work. But we've all also experienced narratives where everything suddenly and very satisfyingly makes sense and all the pieces of the narrative click into place. On a number of occasions and in a number of different ways, the Russian playwright and short story writer Anton Chekhov famously said that if you show the audience a pistol on the wall in the first act, then that pistol has to go off in the third act. This has been quoted so often that it has become a cliché. But like many clichés about writing, it's fundamentally true, and it is indeed a fundamental insight about creating a plot. Part of what Chekhov means is simply that you have to play fair with the audience or the reader. You can't have a character suddenly waving a pistol around without giving us some hint early on that waving a pistol around was at least a possibility. But he's also saying that you need to pay attention to what details you include and when you include them. If you show a pistol on the wall and nobody uses it, you set up an expectation in the reader and then thwarted it. Unless, of course, you intended it as a red herring, which is basically an act of false foreshadowing. But if that's not the case, then showing us the pistol and then never having it turn up again is just as bad as producing a pistol out of thin air. Chekhov's rule about the pistol has an even deeper meaning, though, which lies in its implicit reminder that a plot is not like real life. In our ordinary lives, we see countless details pass before us every day. Peoples, things, the weather, the news, all of it. In real life, we have to decide on the fly, usually subconsciously, what's important and what's not. But a narrative, as I keep reminding you, is not like real life. Every detail has a meaning. Every detail has been placed there by the writer for a specific purpose. And as the writer, you have to think about what details are important, what details you can ignore or leave out, and in what order you introduce them. That is what foreshadowing is all about. Let's look at two examples. The first comes from Flannery O'Connor's famous short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, which is one of the most unsettling stories in American fiction. It's about a Southern family who take off on a fateful road trip to Florida. The story is told mostly, though not entirely, from the point of view of the family's unnamed grandmother. The very first line is, "The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida." In the same paragraph, she tries to talk her son Bailey out of going by pointing out a story she's just read in the newspaper. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with her hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida, and you read here what it says he did to those people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Now, spoiler alert, the grandmother and her family take off for Florida anyway, and along the way they do indeed run into the Misfit. Things do not go well. The first time you read this story, if nobody has given away the ending the way I just did, this little episode in the very first paragraph comes across as nothing more than gentle family comedy. All O'Connor seems to be doing is evoking an old woman's groundless paranoia, her clumsy attempt to manipulate her son, and her son's taciturn refusal to be manipulated. Indeed, until the Misfit himself turns up about 2/3 of the way into the story, A Good Man is Hard to Find is basically a comic account of the family's road trip, complete with bickering children and a colorful episode at a barbecue shack. It isn't until the final few pages, when the story closes around your heart like a steel trap, that you realize how efficiently detailed and tightly constructed it is. Without that bit of foreshadowing in the first paragraph, the story simply wouldn't have the same effect. At the beginning of A Good Man is Hard to Find, O'Connor hides a bit of menace that we don't even realize is menace until it's too late to avoid it. Let's take another, less spoilerish example. Joseph Conrad's Nostromo is an epic novel about a revolution in a fictional South American country called Costaguana. The main economic asset of Costaguana is a silver mine owned by an Englishman named Charles Gould. In the days before the revolution, Gould decides to hide his entire stockpile of silver so that the revolutionaries can't get their hands on it. To do this, he puts the silver on a barge, which he entrusts to an Italian sailor named Nostromo and a young journalist named Martin Decoud. These two men take the silver to an island off the coast of Costaguana to keep it safe from the rebels. Nostromo is a big, complicated novel with many characters, and like Lord Jim, it has a fractured chronology, but that's the central episode in the book. The silver is a metaphor not only for Gould's power as a colonialist, it's also a symbol for the corruptibility of human beings. The title character, Nostromo, is admired above all for his reliability and trustworthiness, and in the end, the effect the silver has on him becomes the central moral dilemma of the book. Now, the opening chapter of Nostromo is a masterpiece of exposition, consisting mainly of a long, evocative description of this fictional country's geography. But starting in the third paragraph, Conrad tells us a local legend about two foreigners, whom he identifies as Americanos perhaps, but gringos of some sort for certain. Many years ago, they ventured onto a remote peninsula in search of some legendary buried gold and were never heard from again. Their story goes on for 2 more paragraphs, ending with this. The two gringos, spectral and alive, are believed to be dwelling to this day among the rocks under the fatal spell of their success. Their souls cannot tear themselves away from their bodies mounting guard over the discovered treasure. They are now rich and hungry and thirsty, a strange theory of tenacious gringo ghosts suffering in their starved and parched flesh of defiant heretics, where a Christian would have renounced and been released. Now, the first time you read Nostromo, this reads as if it's just a bit of folklore, thrown in by Conrad for local color and nothing more. It isn't until you read the novel a second or third time that you realize that this episode, which is only a couple hundred words or so, is a foreshadowing of the entire story. Specifically, it foreshadows the fates of Nostromo and Decoud. After depositing the silver on an island off the coast of Costaguana, Nostromo swims back to shore, leaving Decoud behind with the silver. While Nostromo becomes a hero by helping to defeat the revolution, Decoud, all alone on the lonely island, succumbs to despair. Finally, he rows out to sea, weighs his body down with 2 ingots of silver, and shoots himself. Nostromo returns too late and finds that Decoud is gone and probably dead. Because he believes he isn't getting as much credit for his heroism as he deserves, Nostromo tells everyone that the silver was lost at sea. Then, for the rest of his life, he slowly gets rich off the treasure by retrieving it 1 ingot at a time. At the end of the book, in a rather melodramatic turn of events, he loses his life because of the silver. So you can see that, by the end of the novel, the brief story of the Americans who haunt a missing treasure in the first chapter has happened again, in much more detail, with Decoud and Nostromo. Just like the 2 gringos, they experience both a spiritual and physical death because of treasure. This is an expert bit of foreshadowing, giving us not only the plot in a nutshell, but the novel's central theme. Even if you never read the novel more than once, this story registers in your subconscious and helps to prepare the way for the more complicated version that comes later on. In this lecture, we've only scratched the surface of the variations you can play on the traditional plot. There are many, many more ways to vary a traditional plot than I've got time to explore here. But as I've said, while the traditional plot is very sturdy and adaptable, it's not the only way to structure a narrative. In the next lecture, I'm going to do a brisk trot through the Epiphany short story and the modernist and postmodernist novel to show you some other ways that writers have structured fiction. We'll be looking specifically at Anton Chekhov's short story, The Kiss, James Joyce's story The Dead, and Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. In the meantime, here's a simple exercise to explore one of the techniques I talked about in this lecture. Take a particular situation and tell it first as a surprise. Then take the same situation and retell it as a passage of suspense. If you want to use a ticking bomb, have at it, but it doesn't have to be violent. In fact, it can be a ticking bomb equivalent. Take the story I concocted for the first lecture about Sarah and Brad. In the surprise version, you might tell it from Brad's point of view, in which case Sarah's announcement that she wants a divorce is as much a surprise to the reader as it is to Brad. But you might also tell it from Sarah's point of view, in which case the reader would know from the start that she wants a divorce. Then the scene becomes one of suspense as we wait anxiously for Brad to learn the truth. Give it a try. You might have some fun with it.